January 24, 1945. Holzwihr, Alsace-Lorraine. The frozen earth cracks beneath the weight of a German advance. The fog hangs low over the snow-covered farmland, thick as wool, swallowing the skeletal trees that line the irrigation ditches. The temperature hovers just below freezing, and every breath comes out as vapor that vanishes into the white void. Somewhere in that mist, the sound of boots crunching through ice-crusted snow breaks the morning silence. German voices, low and cautious, carry across the field. They move with purpose, a platoon of Wehrmacht infantry pushing toward a burning farmhouse where American forces have established a defensive line. The smell of cordite and burning timber fills the air. And standing alone near a smoldering M10 tank destroyer, his leg shattered by enemy fire, is a young man who weighs barely 140 pounds. He is Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, and in the next 10 minutes he will become a legend written in fire and blood. But to understand how one American soldier held off 30 German infantry and 6 tanks in a suicidal stand that should have ended in his death, we must first understand the desperation that gripped both sides in the winter of 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final brutal phase. The Third Reich, cornered and bleeding, fought with the ferocity of a dying animal. Every kilometer lost brought Allied forces closer to the German heartland, closer to Berlin, closer to the end of a nightmare that had consumed the continent for 6 years. The Wehrmacht, though battered and depleted, still possessed experienced soldiers hardened by years of combat. They knew the terrain of Alsace-Lorraine intimately, had fought over it twice before in living memory, and now they fought not for conquest but for survival. For the fantasy that they might still turn the tide, still hold the line, still prevent the inevitable. The American 7th Army, meanwhile, pushed eastward through the Kalmar Pocket, a stubborn German salient that jutted into Allied-held territory like a dagger aimed at the heart of France. The fighting here was vicious, house to house, field to field, a grinding attrition that consumed men and materiel at an appalling rate. Winter made everything harder. Supply lines stretched thin across frozen roads. Trench foot and frostbite claimed nearly as many casualties as enemy fire. Soldiers on both sides shivered in inadequate uniforms, their fingers too numb to operate weapons properly, their minds dulled by exhaustion and cold. This was not the war of grand maneuvers and sweeping victories that had characterized the breakout from Normandy. This was elemental combat, stripped of glory, reduced to its most primitive equation: kill or be killed, hold or die. Audie Murphy had already seen more combat than most men could survive. At 20 years old, he was a veteran of Sicily, Anzio, southern France, and the Vosges Mountains. He had killed so many enemy soldiers that he had stopped counting. He had watched friends die beside him, had pulled wounded men from burning vehicles, had led desperate attacks across open ground under withering fire. His boyish face, smooth and unmarked, belied the hollowness behind his eyes. He was the son of Texas sharecroppers, raised in poverty so grinding that he had hunted squirrels and rabbits to keep his siblings from starving after his father abandoned the family. He had lied about his age to enlist, desperate to escape the hopelessness of Depression-era rural America, desperate to prove himself, desperate to matter. The Army had given him purpose, had recognized something in this quiet, soft-spoken young man that others had overlooked, a capacity for violence that could be channeled, refined, weaponized. By January 1945, Murphy commanded Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. His men respected him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself, because he led from the front, because when the shooting started he became something else entirely. Something cold and efficient and utterly without fear. But respect in combat is a currency bought with blood, and Murphy had paid that price many times over. He carried the weight of every man he had lost, carried it in the tightness around his eyes, in the way his hands trembled when he tried to light a cigarette. In the nightmares that jolted him awake in the few hours he managed to sleep. On that frozen morning near Holzwihr, Murphy's company held a tenuous position along a wooded area adjacent to open farmland. The tactical situation was precarious. They occupied a salient, exposed on 3 sides, with limited artillery support and no armor reserves. The Germans had been probing their lines for 2 days, testing for weaknesses, preparing for a major counterattack. Murphy knew it was coming. He could feel it in the unnatural quiet that preceded the storm, in the increased radio chatter his intelligence section intercepted, in the way the enemy mortars had registered their positions with methodical precision. When the attack came, it would come hard, and his understrength company would bear the brunt of it. The German assault began at dawn with an artillery barrage that turned the frozen ground into a moonscape of craters and splintered trees. The screaming of Nebelwerfer rockets, the distinctive sound that American GIs called screaming mimes, preceded the infantry advance. 6 Panzer tanks and tank destroyers emerged from the fog like prehistoric monsters, their 75 guns traversing back and forth, searching for targets. Behind them came the infantry, perhaps 30 or 40 men, moving in practiced fire and maneuver tactics, using the armor as mobile cover. They advanced with the confidence of soldiers who had done this 100 times before, who knew that overwhelming force applied decisively would crack any defensive line. Murphy's defensive position began to collapse almost immediately. The lead M10 tank destroyer, positioned to cover the approach route, took a direct hit and burst into flames. The crew bilayed out, running through the snow toward the relative safety of the tree line. Machine gun fire from the advancing Germans cut down 2 of them before they reached cover. Murphy's infantry platoons, spread thin across a frontage too wide for their numbers, began taking casualties from the combined tank and infantry assault. The logical decision, the tactically sound decision, was to withdraw before they were encircled and destroyed. Murphy ordered most of his company to fall back to a secondary defensive line in the woods, where they could consolidate and call for artillery support. But Murphy did not withdraw with them. Perhaps it was pride that held him there, the stubborn refusal to yield ground to an enemy he had beaten so many times before. Perhaps it was duty, the bone-deep conviction that leaders do not abandon their positions while men still depend on them. Or perhaps it was something darker, a recognition that he had survived so much already that death had become abstract, a theoretical concept that applied to other people but not to him. Whatever the reason, Murphy remained at the forward position, using the field telephone to call in artillery coordinates. Determined to delay the German advance long enough for his company to establish a proper defensive line. That was when the German tank round struck near his position, the concussive blast lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the frozen ground. Shrapnel tore through his right leg, shredding muscle and splintering bone. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot agony that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He could feel blood filling his boot, warm against the cold, could see it spreading dark across the snow. He tried to stand and his leg collapsed beneath him. The German infantry, seeing an isolated American officer wounded and alone, began to close in for the kill. Their flanking movement would bring them within grenade range in less than a minute. Murphy looked at the burning M10 tank destroyer, smoke pouring from its open hatches, flames licking at its ammunition racks. The vehicle was effectively destroyed, abandoned by its crew, a useless hulk waiting to explode. But mounted on its turret was a perfectly functional .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun, perhaps the most devastating infantry weapon in the American arsenal. The M2 fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 550 rounds per minute, each bullet capable of punching through brick walls, light armor, or human bodies with equal efficiency. The gun's effective range exceeded 1,000 meters, and in the hands of a trained operator, it could deliver withering, sustained fire that would shred an infantry formation in seconds. What Murphy did next defied every survival instinct, every tactical principle, every reasonable calculation of risk and reward. He dragged himself through the snow to the burning tank destroyer, hauled himself onto the rear deck using his arms alone, and climbed into the turret. The metal was hot enough to burn through his gloves. Flames crept closer to the ammunition storage, any one of which could detonate and vaporize him instantly. The tank was an obvious target, already zeroed by German gunners, certain to draw every available weapon. But it also provided an elevated firing position with clear fields of fire across the approaching enemy formation. Murphy gripped the spade handles of the .50 caliber and traversed the gun toward the advancing Germans. He had perhaps 200 rounds of linked ammunition remaining in the box, enough for sustained fire lasting maybe 30 seconds if he controlled his trigger discipline. The enemy infantry had closed to within 100 meters, moving in disciplined squad rushes, covering each other with suppressive fire. Behind them, the Panzer tanks continued their advance, their commanders likely assuming that any remaining American resistance would collapse within minutes. The first burst from Murphy's machine gun caught the lead German squad in the open, cutting through them like a scythe through wheat. The .50 caliber rounds, each as long as a man's hand and as thick as his thumb, struck with devastating kinetic energy. Bodies jerked and tumbled, equipment flew apart, the snow erupted in geysers of red. Murphy traversed left, caught another group trying to flank, held the trigger down for a 3-second burst that killed 4 men and wounded 2 others. The distinctive hammering roar of the M2, deeper and louder than any rifle or light machine gun, dominated the battlefield. It was a sound that German soldiers had learned to fear throughout the war, the sound of American industrial might transformed into directed violence. The German advance staggered, then halted. Their training emphasized aggressive forward movement under fire, but that training assumed the enemy would be suppressed, would have their heads down, would be too terrified to return effective fire. Instead, they faced a single machine gun operated by a man who seemed immune to fear, who fired with mechanical precision, who adjusted his aim based on where they were going rather than where they were. Every time a soldier broke cover to advance, Murphy's fire found him. Every time a squad leader tried to organize a flanking movement, Murphy traversed and cut him down. The psychological effect was immense. The Germans had expected to overwhelm a retreating enemy to mop up scattered resistance to secure the position before noon. Instead, they were pinned down in open terrain by a lone gunman on a burning vehicle who refused to die. The German company commander, watching his attack falter, made the obvious decision: destroy the tank destroyer with direct fire. He radioed his armor support, and within seconds, 2 panzers traversed their main guns toward Murphy's position. The first round passed so close that Murphy felt the pressure wave, heard the supersonic crack, watched the shell detonate against a tree 50 meters behind him. The second round struck the ground in front of the M10, showering him with frozen earth and shrapnel. Murphy knew that the next shot would find its mark, that the mathematical certainty of ballistics and ranging would bring high-explosive death within seconds. The rational response would have been to bail out, to abandon the gun, to save himself while he still could. Instead, Murphy continued firing. He emptied his first ammunition box and reloaded with a fresh belt, his movements smooth and practiced despite the heat radiating from the burning vehicle, despite the blood loss weakening him, despite the absolute certainty that he was going to die. He engaged the German infantry with short, controlled bursts, forcing them to remain prone in the snow, preventing them from advancing or maneuvering. He fired at the tank commander's cupolas, forcing them to button up and fight blind, degrading their ability to coordinate. He targeted any soldier who showed leadership initiative, any soldier who tried to rally his comrades, systematically decapitating the German command structure. The field telephone, which Murphy had somehow brought with him onto the burning tank, crackled with the voice of his artillery liaison officer. Murphy, still firing with one hand, used the other to call in adjustments to the American artillery batteries, positioned several kilometers to the rear. His corrections were precise, methodical, spoken in the flat tone of a man reading a shopping list, rather than directing fire while wounded and under direct assault. He walked the shells closer to the German position, adjusting by 50-meter increments, watching the explosions creep forward until they began falling among the enemy infantry. The combination of artillery and machine gun fire created an interlocking kill zone that the Germans could neither advance through nor withdraw from without accepting catastrophic casualties. For 10 minutes, Audie Murphy held that position. 10 minutes that stretched into subjective eternity, 10 minutes during which he became the physical embodiment of American firepower. The human manifestation of industrial warfare conducted by a democracy that could afford to equip even its individual soldiers with weapons of overwhelming lethality. The M2 Browning he operated was not a precision instrument. It was a brute force solution to the tactical problem of killing as many enemy soldiers as possible in the shortest time. It represented a fundamentally American approach to warfare. When faced with a problem, apply overwhelming material superiority until the problem ceases to exist. The German attack finally broke. The survivors, perhaps half the original force, withdrew in disorder, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead scattered across the snow. The panzers reversed course, their commanders recognizing that unsupported armor in open terrain against coordinated American artillery was a death sentence. Murphy ceased fire, his hands trembling on the gun, his vision tunneling from blood loss and shock. Smoke continued to pour from the M10's engine compartment. Flames had spread to the turret interior. He knew he should climb down, but his body refused to obey. He had held the position. His company was safe, that was enough. When Murphy's men finally reached him, carrying him down from the burning tank destroyer before it exploded, they found him barely conscious, his uniform soaked with blood. His hands blistered from the hot metal, his eyes unfocused. They rushed him to an aid station where medics worked frantically to stabilize him, to stop the bleeding, to save his shattered leg. He would survive, though he would carry shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life, though he would walk with a slight limp. Though the nightmares would intensify until they drove him to the edge of madness in the years after the war. The German soldiers who survived the engagement told a different story, one filtered through the disbelief of men who had witnessed something that violated their understanding of how combat worked. They reported facing an entire American platoon supported by armor and artillery, because the alternative. Admitting that a single wounded man had stopped their advance and killed or wounded half their number was psychologically untenable. When interrogated later, one German lieutenant insisted that the Americans must have had at least 3 machine guns and a forward observer team. Because no individual soldier could have delivered such accurate and sustained fire while calling in artillery adjustments simultaneously. The interrogator did not correct him, let them believe what they needed to believe, but the physical evidence told the truth: a single machine gun, a single telephone line. Hundreds of expended brass casings scattered across the deck of a destroyed tank destroyer. Boot prints in the snow showing where one man had dragged himself to the vehicle, had climbed aboard despite catastrophic injuries, had remained there until the German force withdrew. The American artillery liaison officer who had spoken with Murphy throughout the engagement testified that Murphy's voice had remained calm and precise even as he described enemy soldiers closing to within 10 meters of his position. Even as he reported taking direct tank fire, even as he calmly noted that he was getting low on ammunition. What drove Audie Murphy to make that stand has been debated by military historians, psychologists, and biographers for 8 decades. Some argue it was tactical genius, recognition that holding the Germans at that point would prevent a breakthrough that could have collapsed the entire American line. Others suggest it was trauma-induced dissociation, that Murphy's mind had detached from the danger his body faced, allowing him to function with mechanical efficiency while his conscious self observed from a distance. Still others claim it was simpler than that, the stubborn Texas pride of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, overlooked, told he was too small, too young, too poor, too insignificant to matter. Perhaps all of those explanations contain truth. But there is another factor that the German soldiers could not have understood. A fundamental difference in material culture that shaped the psychology of American combat troops in ways both obvious and subtle. Audie Murphy fought with the absolute confidence that if he survived the next 10 minutes, there would be more ammunition, more artillery support, more reinforcements, more of everything. American logistics in World War II represented the most sophisticated supply network ever created, capable of delivering millions of tons of materiel across thousands of miles of ocean and distributing it to frontline units with clockwork efficiency. An American soldier in Europe consumed an average of 67 pounds of supplies per day, everything from food and fuel to bullets and bandages. All of it flowing from an industrial base so vast that it literally outproduced the rest of the world combined. German soldiers, by contrast, fought with the knowledge that every bullet they fired, every shell they expended, every tank they lost could not be replaced. The Wehrmacht in early 1945 scraped together men and equipment from increasingly desperate sources. Undertrained teenagers from the Hitler Youth, overaged veterans pulled from rear-echelon duties. Captured French and Czech equipment, pressed into service despite incompatible parts and ammunition. They advanced on foot because they lacked fuel for vehicles, attacked with limited artillery support because shells were rationed, withdrew when they should have held because they could not afford the casualties required to maintain their positions. They fought with the desperation of men who knew the war was lost, who knew their nation was being destroyed, but who continued fighting because the alternative was unthinkable. This material disparity shaped combat psychology in profound ways. American soldiers attacked with aggression born of confidence, knowing that if an assault failed, there would be another one tomorrow with fresh troops and renewed support. German soldiers defended with the ferocity of men who understood that every position lost brought the enemy closer to their homes, to their families, to the final reckoning. The tactical results played out across thousands of small engagements like the one at Holzwihr. American forces accepting casualties that would have crippled a Wehrmacht formation. Replacing losses overnight, resuming operations the next morning as if nothing had happened. The .50 caliber machine gun that Murphy used to such devastating effect was itself a symbol of this material abundance. The M2 Browning, designed in the 1920s, had been manufactured in quantities that staggered the imagination. Over 2 million units produced during the war, distributed across every theater. Mounted on vehicles, aircraft, ships, and static defensive positions. It was so reliable that guns manufactured in 1943 remained in service 80 years later, still functioning perfectly after firing millions of rounds. It represented American engineering philosophy. Build something robust enough to function under the worst conditions, simple enough that any soldier can operate it. And produce it in quantities that ensure every unit has access to overwhelming firepower. German military doctrine, by contrast, emphasized precision over volume, quality over quantity. Their MG-42 machine gun was arguably superior in many respects, with a higher rate of fire and more advanced design features. But it required more maintenance, more skilled operators, more expensive manufacturing processes. When German soldiers lost an MG-42 in combat, replacement might take days or weeks. When American soldiers lost an M2, another appeared within hours. The strategic implications were clear. The side that could afford to waste resources would eventually overwhelm the side that could not. In the days following the engagement at Holzwihr, as Murphy recovered in a field hospital and his superiors compiled after-action reports, the story began to take on mythic dimensions. Soldiers who had not been present claimed to have witnessed it. Details were embellished, numbers inflated, the already impressive reality enhanced until it bordered on fiction. This was understandable. Men needed heroes, needed proof that individual courage could still matter in an industrialized war that seemed designed to render individual action meaningless. They needed to believe that one man, if he possessed sufficient skill and determination, could hold back the tide, could make a difference, could embody all the virtues that democracy supposedly represented. The American military, recognizing the propaganda value, ensured that Murphy's story received maximum publicity. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, presented personally by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. The citation described his actions in dry official language that somehow failed to capture the desperate immediacy of the moment. The almost suicidal courage required to remain on a burning vehicle while directing fire against overwhelming enemy forces. Murphy received the medal with the same quiet demeanor he brought to everything, showing no emotion, offering no speeches. Simply accepting the recognition as he had accepted every other burden the war placed upon him. But the medal, the publicity, the recognition could not erase what the war had done to him. Murphy returned to combat because that was what soldiers did, because his leg healed sufficiently to allow him to walk, because the war continued and men were still needed to fight it. He participated in the final push into Germany, witnessed the liberation of concentration camps, saw the full extent of the horror that had driven the war. He was in Austria when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, and he felt nothing, no elation, no relief, only a hollow exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. After the war, Murphy struggled to reintegrate into civilian society, struggled with insomnia and nightmares and sudden rages that terrified him with their intensity. He achieved fame as a Hollywood actor, starring in his own biographical film, using his boyish good looks and natural charisma to build a successful career. But the facade was fragile. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, started at sudden noises, retreated into long silences during which his eyes became distant and unfocused. He became an advocate for veterans suffering from what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, speaking publicly about his own struggles at a time when such admissions could end careers. He understood with a clarity born of experience that the war had broken something fundamental inside him, something that would never fully heal. The German soldiers who faced Murphy at Holzwihr, those who survived, returned to a destroyed nation where they were not celebrated as heroes but viewed with suspicion and shame. Many never spoke of their wartime experiences, carrying their memories in silence until they died. They had fought for a regime whose crimes placed them on the wrong side of history, had participated in a war of aggression and genocide that tainted every act of individual courage. Every moment of unit cohesion, every sacrifice made. Their defeat was total, absolute, both militarily and morally. There would be no parades, no medals, no Hollywood films celebrating their actions. There was only the burden of having served evil, intentionally or not, and the knowledge that they could never escape that association. Yet in the specific engagement at Holzwihr, stripped of its broader political and moral context, what occurred was simply combat in its most elemental form. Soldiers attempting to complete their mission, other soldiers attempting to stop them, the outcome determined by skill, courage, firepower, and random chance. Murphy's stand was tactically brilliant, militarily significant, and individually heroic by any objective measure. That it occurred in service of a just cause against an objectively evil regime does not diminish the courage required. That the German soldiers attacked with professional competence despite serving that evil regime does not make them heroes. But it does make them formidable opponents whose defeat required exceptional performance. The broader lesson of Holzwihr extends beyond individual heroism or tactical brilliance. It reveals the fundamental advantage that democratic nations possess when waging industrial warfare: the ability to mobilize resources so vast that individual losses become statistically irrelevant. To produce equipment so abundantly that soldiers can employ it without regard to cost. To sustain operations indefinitely through sheer material superiority. Murphy's machine gun, his artillery support, his immediate evacuation to competent medical care. His replacement by fresh troops within hours, all of these flowed from a system designed to project power through abundance rather than scarcity. Totalitarian regimes, regardless of their initial military sophistication, inevitably collapse under the weight of prolonged industrial warfare because they cannot match the productive capacity of mobilized democracies. Nazi Germany's early victories came through tactical innovation and operational audacity, but once the war became a contest of resources, once it became a question of who could produce more tanks, more aircraft, more shells, more of everything, the outcome was predetermined. The Soviet Union, despite suffering appalling casualties and territorial losses, simply outproduced Germany in every category. The United States, entering the war later, achieved even more absurd production ratios. Building bombers and ships and vehicles in quantities that made replacement of losses a mere administrative detail. This material advantage shaped soldier psychology in ways that determined tactical outcomes. American troops attacked with confidence because they knew that failure was temporary, that tomorrow would bring another opportunity with fresh resources. German troops defended with desperation because they knew that every lost position, every expended shell, every dead soldier represented irreplaceable attrition, moving them closer to inevitable defeat. The psychological burden of fighting a losing war, of knowing that individual courage and tactical skill cannot overcome strategic reality, breaks unit cohesion and individual morale more effectively than any weapon. Audie Murphy, standing alone on that burning tank destroyer, represented the apotheosis of American combat power in World War II. A single soldier, equipped with the products of democratic industry, confident in the support structure behind him, willing to risk death because he knew his sacrifice would matter, would accomplish something, would contribute to ultimate victory. The German soldiers facing him represented the exhaustion of an evil empire's military capacity, experienced and dangerous still, but ultimately doomed by their service to a system that had squandered its resources on conquest and genocide. The 10 minutes at Holzwihr condensed the entire war into microcosm. Individual courage meeting industrial capacity, tactical skill amplified by material abundance. Democratic values manifested through directed violence against totalitarian aggression. Murphy's survival was not miraculous or inexplicable. It was the logical outcome of a system designed to support its soldiers, to equip them with overwhelming firepower, to ensure that when they took desperate stands, they did so with the backing of a nation that could afford to waste resources in pursuit of victory. In the decades after the war, the frozen field near Holzwihr returned to agricultural use, the scars of combat gradually erased by seasons of planting and harvest. The local French population, caught between German occupation and Allied liberation, rebuilt their destroyed homes and resumed their lives. Few physical traces remain of the January morning, when 30 German soldiers learned that numerical advantage means nothing against a determined man with a machine gun and unlimited ammunition. The burning M10 was salvaged for scrap, the expended brass casings collected, the blood-soaked snow melted into soil that now grows corn and wheat. But the story persists, retold in countless histories and biographies, analyzed by military academies as a case study in individual combat effectiveness. Celebrated as proof that courage and skill can overcome overwhelming odds. It has been simplified, mythologized, transformed into a parable about American exceptionalism and the warrior spirit. Most of these retellings miss the deeper truth. That Murphy's stand was not exceptional in its courage. Thousands of soldiers on all sides demonstrated similar bravery throughout the war, but in its perfect illustration of how material superiority transforms individual courage into tactical victory. Murphy himself rarely spoke of the engagement in his later years, deflecting questions with practiced humility, changing the subject when interviewers pressed for details. He understood something that most of his admirers did not, that what he had done at Holzwihr was born not from heroism but from trauma. Not from courage, but from the dissociation that allowed him to function in combat, while some part of his consciousness observed from a detached distance. He had not been fearless. He had been beyond fear, operating in a psychological space where survival instincts no longer functioned normally, where death became abstract and action became mechanical. This is the reality of combat that decorations and citations cannot capture, that Hollywood films simplify into narrative coherence, that civilian society prefers not to acknowledge. That extraordinary acts in warfare often emerge from damaged psyches, that the men most effective at killing are frequently those most broken by the experience. That courage and trauma are not opposites, but intertwined aspects of the same psychological response to existential threat. Murphy's nightmares, his insomnia, his struggles with violent impulses after the war, these were not separate from his Medal of Honor action but intrinsically connected to it. The price extracted for the ability to function with lethal efficiency, while wounded and surrounded and facing certain death. The German soldiers who withdrew from Holzwihr carried their own trauma, their own nightmares of watching comrades cut down by fire they could not suppress, of facing an enemy who seemed unkillable, of the helpless recognition that they had lost a tactical engagement they should have won. They returned to units that were shadows of their former strength, fought in battles they knew were futile, retreated toward a homeland that no longer existed except as a geographic concept. Their war ended not with honor but with surrender and captivity, their military tradition tainted beyond redemption by association with genocide. Yet in that specific frozen field on that January morning, what occurred was soldiers doing what soldiers do, following orders, attempting to survive. Killing enemy combatants in pursuit of tactical objectives. The moral dimension of the war, the absolute evil of the Nazi regime. The genocidal ideology that drove the conflict. All of this existed above and beyond the immediate tactical reality of men shooting at each other across snow-covered farmland. Murphy did not hold that position because he was fighting evil. He held it because retreating would doom his company, because his training and experience told him what needed to be done, because some part of him had moved beyond calculation to pure instinct. This is perhaps the final lesson of Holzwihr, that individual actions in warfare occur in a moral context they cannot escape, but that the immediate tactical reality is often divorced from that context. Soldiers fight for their comrades, for their own survival, for the completion of immediate missions, not for the grand strategic objectives or ideological principles that national leaders invoke to justify war. Murphy's heroism was real, his skill undeniable, his impact on that specific engagement decisive. That all of this occurred in service of a just cause against an evil regime does not diminish his individual achievement. But neither does it erase the psychological cost he paid for his effectiveness as a killer of men. The .50 caliber machine gun, that instrument of Murphy's defiance, continues to serve in American military forces 80 years later, still delivering devastating firepower. Still breaking enemy formations, still embodying the American approach to warfare through overwhelming material application. It has killed in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, in countless smaller conflicts whose names are forgotten by all but those who fought in them. It represents continuity across generations of warfare, proof that some solutions to tactical problems remain valid regardless of technological advancement. But it also represents the weight of violence that democracy must sometimes employ, the blood price that freedom occasionally demands, the recognition that evil regimes rarely surrender to moral arguments alone. Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971, at age 45, his body buried at Arlington National Cemetery among thousands of other soldiers who had served and died. His gravestone is the second most visited site in the cemetery after John F. Kennedy's, a destination for those who seek connection to a generation that fought what they perceive as the last morally uncomplicated war. But there is tragedy in Murphy's life beyond his early death, tragedy in the recognition that the war which made him famous also broke him. That the courage which saved his men at Holzwihr could not save him from the psychological wounds that festered for 26 years after the fighting ended. On winter mornings in Alsace-Lorraine, when fog settles over the frozen fields and the temperature drops below freezing, the landscape looks much as it did in January 1945. The same skeletal trees line the same irrigation ditches, the same farmhouses cluster in small villages connected by narrow roads. Nothing marks the specific spot where Audie Murphy made his stand, no monument or plaque, no indication that something extraordinary occurred there. The earth has absorbed the blood, the seasons have erased the scars. The civilians who farm those fields likely do not know or care what happened there decades before they were born. But for those who understand military history, for those who study the mechanics of combat and the psychology of soldiers under fire, Holzwihr represents something essential about warfare in the industrial age. That individual courage, when combined with overwhelming material support, can achieve tactical results that appear miraculous, but are actually the logical product of systems designed to amplify human capability through mechanical advantage. Murphy's 10 minutes on a burning tank destroyer demonstrated what was possible when a democracy committed its full industrial capacity to war. When abundance replaced scarcity as the fundamental constraint on military operations, when every soldier could fight with confidence that his nation's resources would support his actions. The German soldiers who faced him represented the exhaustion of a different system, one that had promised superiority through ideology and racial identity, one that had squandered its resources on conquest and murder, one that asked its soldiers to fight without the material support necessary to sustain operations, one that ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Their courage in that frozen field was real, their tactical skill evident, but courage and skill alone could not compensate for strategic bankruptcy and moral corruption. This is the truth that the engagement at Holzwihr illuminates, that warfare in the modern age is not decided by individual heroics, but by systems, logistics, industrial capacity, and the ability to sustain operations despite losses. Murphy's heroism mattered because it occurred within a framework that could exploit and amplify his actions. The German soldiers' defeat was inevitable because they fought for a system that could no longer support them. And somewhere in that intersection of individual courage and systemic support lies the essence of how democracies wage war, not through superior ideology or racial identity or martial tradition, but through the boring, unglamorous work of production, supply, and logistical support that transforms individual soldiers into instruments of overwhelming force. The frozen morning at Holzwihr, the burning tank destroyer, the lone machine gun. The German attack broken and scattered, all of it represents a moment when the personal and systemic aligned perfectly. When one man's courage was amplified by his nation's industrial capacity into tactical victory. It was not miraculous, it was not inexplicable. It was simply the arithmetic of industrial warfare calculated with perfect clarity. Abundance multiplied by courage equals victory, scarcity multiplied by desperation equals defeat. The equation was written in blood across that frozen field, and its truth echoes across 8 decades of subsequent conflict, a lesson learned once and validated endlessly thereafter.